The morning sun painted the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson as Ayanna stood on the rocky cliff overlooking her tribal lands. Her long black hair moved gently in the wind, and her dark eyes scanned the horizon with the alertness of a born warrior. At 25, she had earned respect among her people not just as the daughter of Chief Nailnish, but as a fierce protector of Apache traditions and territory. "I fear no man," she whispered to herself, repeating the words that had become her personal creed. These were not empty boasts but truth forged through years of training, fighting, and proving herself in a world where women rarely held such power. Ayanna had been different from other Apache girls since childhood. While they learned to weave baskets and prepare food, she demanded to train with the warriors. Her father, seeing her determination and natural talent, allowed her to learn the ways of combat alongside her brother Keem. She mastered the bow and arrow before her 10th birthday, could track animals and enemies across any terrain, and had never lost a wrestling match against boys her own age. The Apache tribe faced constant threats from expanding white settlements, Mexican raiders, and rival tribes. Through it all, Ayanna had stood firm, leading hunting parties and defensive missions with skill that impressed even the oldest warriors. She had fought in 12 battles and emerged victorious from each one. Her reputation spread beyond her own tribe. Neighboring Apache bands spoke of the fearless woman warrior who could outfight any man. As she climbed down from the cliff toward her village, Ayanna reflected on the previous night's tribal council meeting. The elders had discussed growing concerns about white settlers moving deeper into their ancestral lands. Cattle ranchers were claiming vast territories, and the U.S. military was building new outposts throughout Arizona territory. Many tribes were being forced onto reservations, stripped of their freedom and traditional ways of life. "We will not surrender our land," Ayanna had declared during the meeting. "The mountains, the rivers, the sacred places of our ancestors, these belong to the Apache people. Any who try to take them will face our resistance." Her father had nodded approvingly at her words, though worry lines creased his weathered face. Chief Nailnish was growing older, and tribal leadership would soon pass to the next generation. Many expected Ayanna to play a major role in guiding their people through these difficult times. Walking through the village, Ayanna observed the daily life of her tribe. Children played games that taught them hunting skills while their mothers prepared meals and crafted tools. The men maintained weapons and planned hunting expeditions. Despite the external pressures, the Apache way of life continued as it had for generations. Ayanna called her childhood friend Itzel, approaching with a concerned expression. "Scouts have returned with troubling news. A large group of white men is riding toward our territory from the east." Ayanna's hand instinctively moved to the knife at her belt. "How many? Are they soldiers or settlers?" "Neither," Itzel replied, lowering her voice. "They appear to be cattle ranchers with a large herd. The scouts say there are perhaps 20 men, well armed, moving through the valley where our people hunt deer." This was exactly what the tribal council had feared. Cattle ranchers often claimed land by simply moving their herds onto it, then demanding that native peoples leave areas they had used for centuries. The cattle destroyed grasslands where buffalo and other game animals fed, disrupting the careful balance of nature that sustained Apache life. Ayanna's jaw tightened with determination. "Gather 15 of our best warriors. We will ride out to meet these intruders and make clear that they are not welcome on Apache land." "Should we not consult with your father first?" Itzel asked cautiously. "The chief is meeting with elders from the northern bands about the reservation negotiations," Ayanna replied. "By the time we could reach him and return, these cattlemen might have established camps in our hunting grounds. We must act quickly." Within an hour, Ayanna had assembled a formidable group of Apache warriors. Each was an experienced fighter loyal to her leadership. They painted their faces with traditional war colors and checked their weapons, bows, rifles captured from previous skirmishes, and razor-sharp knives passed down through generations. Ayanna herself prepared with particular care. She wore a buckskin dress decorated with turquoise beads and eagle feathers that marked her status as a war leader. Her long hair was braided with leather strips and feathers. Around her neck hung a silver pendant that had belonged to her grandmother, a powerful medicine woman. Most importantly, she carried her grandfather's war lance, a weapon that had never failed in battle. Remember, she addressed her warriors as they mounted their horses, we go not to start a war but to protect our land. These white men must understand that Apache territory is not free for the taking. We will speak with strength so they will listen. The riding party moved swiftly across the desert landscape, following trails known only to the Apache. Ayana led them through hidden canyons and across dry creek beds, approaching the reported location of the cattle herd from an advantageous position. Her tactical mind automatically assessed the terrain, identifying escape routes and defensive positions should negotiations fail. As they crested a small hill, the Apache warriors got their first view of the intruders. Below them stretched a vast herd of perhaps 500 cattle, more than Ayana had ever seen in one place. The animals were guarded by roughly 20 men on horseback, just as the scouts had reported. But something about this group struck her as different from the typical land-grabbing ranchers they had encountered before. These men appeared more organized and professional than most cattle drivers. Their movements suggested military training, and their equipment looked expensive and well-maintained. Most wore similar clothing, practical work clothes rather than the fancy outfits some wealthy ranchers preferred. They handled their horses with obvious skill and maintained disciplined formation even while managing the cattle. This is no ordinary cattle drive, observed Keem, who had insisted on joining the war party despite Ayana's initial reluctance to include her younger brother. These men have the look of soldiers, though they wear no uniforms. Ayana studied the scene below more carefully. Her brother was right, there was something military about these cowboys. Perhaps they were former cavalry soldiers turned ranchers, or men hired specifically for their fighting abilities. Either way, they would likely prove more dangerous than typical settlers. All the more reason to be firm in our message, she decided. Men who understand warfare will respect strength and clear boundaries. She signaled for her warriors to spread out along the hilltop, making their numbers clearly visible to the cowboys below. Then, she urged her horse forward, beginning the descent toward the cattle herd with the measured pace of someone who feared nothing and no one. The cowboys noticed their approach immediately. Ayana watched as several men pointed toward the Apache riders and began calling out warnings to their companions. The cattle herd shifted nervously as the men moved to defensive positions, but no one drew weapons or made openly hostile gestures. This suggested either confidence or wisdom, possibly both. As Ayana drew closer, she could make out individual faces among the cowboys. They were a diverse group, some young, some old, with the weathered features of men who spent their lives outdoors. Most watched her approach with curiosity rather than fear, which she found both impressive and slightly irritating. She was accustomed to inspiring more obvious respect in potential adversaries. One man, however, caught her attention in a way that surprised her. He sat slightly apart from the others on a magnificent black horse, and, even from a distance, she could see that he carried himself differently. Where the other cowboys seemed tense and alert, this one appeared completely relaxed, as if the approach of armed Apache warriors was merely an interesting development in an otherwise ordinary day. As she came closer, Ayana could see that he was perhaps 30 years old, with sun-streaked brown hair and a lean, muscular build that spoke of years of hard physical work. His clothes were similar to those of his companions but somehow looked better on him. Most striking were his eyes, an unusual shade of gray that seemed to see everything without revealing anything of his own thoughts. For a moment that lasted perhaps 3 heartbeats, those gray eyes met her dark ones across the desert distance. Ayana felt something unexpected flutter in her chest, not fear, for she had long ago conquered that emotion, but something else entirely. Something that had no place in this confrontation between Apache warriors and white intruders. She forced the strange feeling aside and focused on her mission. These men were trespassing on Apache land, and she would make them understand that they must leave. It did not matter that one of them had unusual eyes or sat his horse with uncommon grace. What mattered was protecting her people's territory and way of life. Raising her lance high above her head, Ayana called out in clear, accented English, "You are on Apache land. Turn your cattle and leave this place." The cowboys stirred uneasily, but the gray-eyed man simply nudged his black horse forward a few steps. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the distance between them, calm and respectful but firm. "Ma'am, we're just passing through on our way to new grazing land. We mean no harm to you or your people. All land is Apache land. Ayana replied, her voice ringing with authority. Your cattle eat grass meant for our horses and game animals. You have no right to be here. The man studied her for a long moment, and Ayana found herself oddly aware of his careful attention. Most white men either dismissed her entirely or showed exaggerated fear when confronted by an armed Apache woman. This one seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. I understand your concern, he said finally. But, we have legal papers giving us the right to move these cattle across this territory to new pastures in California. Papers? Ayana's voice cracked like a whip. The earth knows nothing of your papers. This land belonged to Apache people before your government existed, and it will belong to Apache people when your government is dust. A murmur ran through both groups, the Apache warriors expressing approval of their leader's words, while the cowboys seemed uncertain how to respond to such a direct challenge to their authority. The gray-eyed man, however, simply nodded as if her words made perfect sense. You're probably right about that, ma'am. But, right now, we have a job to do and cattle to move. Is there some way we can work this out so nobody gets hurt? His reasonable tone frustrated Ayana more than anger would have. She had come prepared for conflict, ready to drive out hostile invaders through force if necessary. Instead, she found herself facing a man who seemed willing to negotiate, whose respectful manner made it difficult to justify immediate violence. You work it out by leaving, she said firmly. Take your cattle and go back where you came from. Can't do that, the man replied, still calm but with an edge of steel in his voice that suggested he was not as yielding as he appeared. These cattle belong to people who are counting on us to deliver them safely. We gave our word, and we keep our promises. Now there was something in his tone that resonated with Ayana despite her anger. Honor and keeping one's word were concepts she understood deeply. Apache culture placed enormous value on personal integrity and fulfilling one's obligations to others. Still, her duty was clear. Then, you will have to fight us to pass. The gray-eyed cowboy sighed, and, for a moment, Ayana thought she saw genuine regret in his expression. I was afraid you might say that. None of us want trouble with your people, but we can't abandon our responsibilities either. He turned slightly in his saddle to address his men. Boys, it looks like we might have ourselves a situation here. Check your weapons but don't make any threatening moves unless I give the word. Ayana felt a familiar surge of excitement as the possibility of battle grew more real. This was what she had trained for her entire life, the moment when diplomacy ended and warrior skills determined the outcome. She had never lost a fight, never backed down from any challenge. Today would be no different. But, as she prepared to signal her warriors to attack positions, the gray-eyed cowboy did something completely unexpected. He slowly and deliberately removed his hat, revealing hair that caught the sunlight like polished bronze. Then, he performed what could only be described as a formal bow from horseback, a gesture of respect that acknowledged her as an equal rather than dismissing her as merely an obstacle. Ma'am, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air, I don't believe we've been properly introduced. My name is James Robert Thornton, and I'd be honored to know yours before we decide whether we're going to be friends or enemies. The simple courtesy of his request caught Ayana completely off guard. In all her years of confronting intruders on Apache land, no white man had ever asked her name or introduced himself as if she were a person worthy of respect. Most either ignored her entirely or spoke to her as they might address a dangerous animal. For several long moments, she found herself unable to respond. Her warriors waited behind her for orders, while the cowboys below maintained their defensive positions. The desert wind stirred dust devils between the two groups, and, somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried as it circled overhead. Finally, Ayana realized that every eye was upon her, waiting for her response to this unprecedented situation. Her reputation as a fearless leader demanded that she maintain strength and authority, but something about James Robert Thornton's respectful manner made her want to respond in kind. I am Ayana, daughter of Chief Nailnish, protector of Apache lands, she replied formally. And I am still waiting for you to leave our territory. James Thornton replaced his hat and smiled, not the mocking grin she might have expected, but something warmer and more genuine. Well, Miss Ayana, it's a pleasure to meet you, even under these circumstances. Now, about this territory dispute of ours. And so began a confrontation that would change both their lives forever, though neither yet realized it. The Apache woman who feared no man had met the cowboy who would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and her enemies. The desert stretched endlessly around them, vast enough to hold both their peoples, but their immediate world had suddenly become as small as the space between two horses and as charged with possibility as the air before a lightning storm. The sun climbed higher in the Arizona sky, and the fate that would bind Ayana and James together had taken its first steps toward an inevitable collision between two worlds, two hearts, and two people who were far more alike than either would ever admit. 3 days had passed since the tense standoff between Ayana's Apache warriors and James Thornton's cattle drive. The confrontation had ended without bloodshed when James proposed a compromise that surprised everyone present. Instead of forcing his way through Apache territory or turning back, he had suggested establishing a temporary camp while they negotiated a solution that would satisfy both sides. "Your word against mine," he had said to Ayana. "Give me 3 days to prove we mean no harm to your land or people. If I can't convince you we're honorable men just trying to do an honest job, we'll find another route to California." Against the advice of her warriors and her own instincts, Ayana had agreed. Something about James Thornton's straightforward manner had intrigued her, and she wanted to understand these cowboys better before deciding their fate. Now, as she rode toward their camp for the 3rd day of talks, she questioned her decision. The Apache Council had not been pleased when she returned with news of the agreement. Several elders had criticized her choice to negotiate with white intruders rather than simply driving them away by force. Her father, Chief Nailnish, had supported her publicly but privately expressed concerns about her unusual approach. "Daughter," he had said the previous evening, "I have watched you grow into a fierce protector of our people. Your courage and skill are unquestioned. But I sense something different in you since meeting these cowboys. Be careful that sympathy for our enemies does not cloud your judgment." His words troubled Ayana because they held truth she did not want to acknowledge. Something about James Thornton did affect her judgment, though she could not identify exactly what. He treated her with respect, certainly, but she had encountered respectful enemies before. He seemed genuinely interested in finding peaceful solutions, but many negotiators had appeared reasonable before revealing hidden agendas. No, it was something else entirely, something in the way he looked at her, not as an Apache woman or a warrior or even an obstacle, but simply as herself. When their eyes met across the negotiating space, she felt seen in a way that was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. As she approached the cowboy camp, Ayana forced such thoughts from her mind. Today was the final day of talks, and she needed to focus on protecting Apache interests. If James could not convince her of his sincerity, she would order him and his men to leave immediately. The camp surprised her with its organization and cleanliness. Most white travelers left garbage and waste wherever they stopped, showing no respect for the land. These men had established their temporary base with military precision, minimizing their impact on the environment. Their horses were well cared for, their equipment properly maintained, and their cooking fires built to produce minimal smoke. James emerged from a canvas shelter as she approached, and Ayana noticed once again how differently he moved compared to other men she had known. There was no wasted motion, no nervous energy, just a calm confidence that reminded her of experienced Apache hunters. He wore clean clothes and had obviously taken care with his appearance, though whether this was natural habit or an attempt to impress her, she could not tell. "Good morning, Miss Ayana," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "I hope you slept well." "I slept as I always do," she replied neutrally. "Ready to defend my people if necessary." James nodded as if her response was perfectly reasonable. "I'd expect nothing less from someone with your reputation. Would you like some coffee before we talk? Cookie makes it strong enough to wake the dead." Despite herself, Ayana felt curious about cowboy coffee. Apache people sometimes traded for coffee beans with Mexican merchants, but she had never tasted the beverage prepared by white men. "I will try some," she decided. James led her to the camp's cooking area, where a grizzled old man was tending a large pot over glowing coals. "Cookie, this is Miss Ayana, the Apache lady I told you about." Could you pour her some of that paint remover you call coffee? Right, proud to meet you, miss, Cookie said, filling a metal cup with dark liquid that steamed in the cool morning air. Heard tell you can outfight most any man in these parts. That true? It is true, Ayana replied matter-of-factly, accepting the cup. She took a cautious sip and felt her eyes widen at the strong, bitter taste. This is very powerful. Cookie's coffee could wake a hibernating bear, James commented with a smile. We use it to strip rust off our gear when soap won't do the job. The old cook cackled with laughter. Boss is just jealous 'cause he can't handle real coffee. Has to water his down like he was still nursing. Watching this good-natured banter between the two men, Ayana found herself relaxing slightly. She had expected a harsh, military-style camp where men followed orders without question. Instead, she observed something that looked almost like family. The cowboys treated each other with casual affection and mutual respect that reminded her of relationships within her own tribe. Would you like to meet some of the other boys? James asked. Might help you understand what kind of men we really are. Before Ayana could respond, a commotion erupted near the cattle herd. Shouting voices and the sound of running horses drew everyone's attention toward the eastern edge of camp. James immediately started toward the disturbance, and Ayana followed, her hand instinctively moving to her weapons. What's the trouble, Pete? James called to a young cowboy who was racing toward them on a lathered horse. Rustlers? Pete gasped, pulling his mount to a stop. Maybe 8 or 10 men, coming up from the South Canyon. They got about 50 head of our cattle cut out from the main herd. James's expression hardened, and Ayana saw the relaxed camp host disappear, replaced by someone who was clearly accustomed to command and crisis. How far away? Half-mile, maybe less. They're driving the cattle toward that rocky country where they can lose anybody following. Saddle my horse, James ordered, already moving toward his gear. Tell the boys to arm up, but don't start shooting unless they shoot first. We want those cattle back, but we don't need a war. Ayana watched this rapid transformation with interest. In moments, the entire camp had become a military unit preparing for action. Men checked weapons, saddled horses, and received orders with practiced efficiency. Whatever these cowboys had been before becoming cattle drivers, they were definitely not ordinary ranch hands. You might want to get clear of here, Miss Ayana, James said as he strapped on his gun belt. This could get dangerous. His assumption that she would retreat to safety sparked immediate anger. I do not run from danger, she said coldly. But these cattle thieves are not my concern. Let white men fight white men. James paused in his preparations, studying her face. You know, you're absolutely right. This isn't your fight, and I have no business asking you to risk yourself for our problems. His agreement surprised her. She had expected argument or pleading. Then, why do you look at me as if you hope I will help anyway? Because, James said quietly, rustlers who steal cattle often attack anyone they think might identify them later. Your village isn't that far from here. If these are the kind of men I think they are, your people could be in danger too. The possibility had not occurred to Ayana, but she realized James was right. Cattle thieves often killed witnesses to avoid being tracked down by law enforcement. If they saw Apache warriors in the area, they might decide to eliminate potential threats. How many men do you have? She asked. 17, counting myself. Why? 8 or 10 rustlers in rocky country where they can take cover, Ayana said, thinking tactically. Your men will be exposed crossing open ground to reach them. You will lose people. James's jaw tightened. Maybe. But those cattle represent months of work and everything we own. We can't just let them be stolen. Ayana found herself facing an unexpected decision. Everything she had been taught about white men suggested they were natural enemies who would betray any Apache who helped them. But James Thornton and his men had shown respect for her land and people. They had negotiated honestly and kept their promises. More importantly, she was beginning to understand that they were not the land-grabbing settlers she had first assumed. There is another way, she heard herself saying. A path through the rocks that rustlers would not know.
Apache hunters have used it for generations.
James stopped adjusting his saddle and turned to face her fully.
Are you saying what I think you're saying?
I am saying that cattle thieves are enemies to Apache people as well as cowboys. They bring violence and chaos to lands where we hunt and gather food.
Perhaps it would serve my interests to help remove them.
Miss Ayanna, James said slowly, if you're offering to guide us through those rocks, I'd be more grateful than I can say.
But I won't ask you to risk your life for our cattle.
You do not ask, she replied firmly.
I offer. There is a difference.
20 minutes later, Ayanna found herself riding beside James Thornton at the head of 17 armed cowboys, leading them toward a confrontation that would test everything she thought she knew about choosing sides. The trail she had chosen would bring them above the rustlers' position, where the terrain favored the attackers rather than the defenders.
As they rode, James asked questions that revealed his tactical intelligence. He wanted to know about sight lines, escape routes, and the best positions for his men to take cover.
His questions showed respect for her knowledge and genuine desire to minimize casualties on both sides. You think like a soldier, Ayanna observed as they approached the hidden trail.
I was a soldier, James admitted. Cavalry, for 8 years.
These boys were two different units, but we all served during the Apache Wars.
This revelation hit Ayanna like a physical blow.
The Apache Wars had been a series of conflicts between her people and the U.S. Army that had resulted in death and suffering on both sides. Some of these men had probably fought against Apache warriors, possibly against men she knew personally.
You fought against my people, she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Yes, James said simply. And I'm not proud of everything that happened during those years.
A lot of good people died on both sides, often for reasons that made no sense to the men doing the fighting.
Yet you ask me to help you now?
James reined in his horse, forcing the column to stop. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of experience and regret that made Ayanna listen carefully.
Miss Ayanna, I won't insult you by pretending the past didn't happen.
Some of my men probably fought against your warriors, and some of your warriors probably fought against soldiers we knew and respected. But that was then, and this is now. Today, we're facing men who prey on anyone weaker than themselves. They'll steal from cowboys, settlers, Apache, Mexican farmers, anyone who has something they want. He gestured toward the rocky terrain ahead.
Those rustlers in there aren't fighting for their homeland or their families or any cause worth dying for.
They're just thieves and killers. If we can't put aside old differences to deal with people like that, then we're all going to suffer for it. Ayanna considered his words as the desert wind stirred dust around their horses. Everything he said made logical sense, but logic was not the only consideration. Helping former cavalry soldiers attack anyone, even cattle thieves, felt like a betrayal of her people's blood. Your war against Apache people was also about taking what you wanted, she pointed out.
You're right, James agreed. And I won't try to defend everything the army did.
But I will say this, I never killed anyone who wasn't shooting at me first, and I never harmed women, children, or anyone who surrendered. Most of these boys can say the same. A younger cowboy named Danny spoke up from behind them. Miss, if it helps any, half of us joined the army because we were too poor or too stupid to do anything else. Wasn't about hating Apache people, we just needed work and 3 meals a day. Several other men murmured agreement, and Ayanna realized that her mental image of cavalry soldiers as dedicated Indian haters might be overly simple. These were working men who had found themselves in uniform during a complicated time, not necessarily the cruel enemies Apache stories often described.
Besides, Cookie added with a grin, most of us was more afraid of Apache warriors than we was angry at 'em. Y'all had a reputation for being tougher than a boot full of rattlesnakes.
Despite the seriousness of the situation, Ayanna found herself almost smiling at the old man's frank admission. Apache warriors had indeed cultivated fearsome reputations, both as psychological warfare and because their survival often depended on enemies being too frightened to pursue them.
We are wasting time, she decided finally. Cattle thieves will not wait while we discuss history. Does that mean you'll still help us? James asked.
Ayanna urged her horse forward without answering directly, but her actions spoke clearly enough. Within minutes, she was leading the cowboys up a narrow trail that wound between towering rock formations, toward a position that would give them clear advantage over the rustlers below. The hidden path required single-file travel and careful attention to footing, but it would place them exactly where James needed to be. As they climbed, Ayanna found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken in just 3 days. She had come to drive away white intruders and, instead, found herself leading them into battle against other white men. "There," she whispered, pointing toward a cluster of boulders ahead. "From those rocks, you can see the entire canyon where they hold your cattle." James studied the position and nodded approvingly. "Perfect. We'll have clear shots, and they won't be able to retreat without riding straight at us." He turned to address his men. "Remember, boys, we want those cattle back and we want to discourage these fellows from trying this again. But we're not executioners. Give them a chance to surrender before you start shooting." As the cowboys positioned themselves among the rocks, Ayanna remained beside James, watching the scene unfold below. The rustlers had driven the stolen cattle into a box canyon where they were examining the animals and, apparently, deciding which ones to keep. They seemed confident and unhurried, obviously not expecting pursuit. 8 men, just like Pete said, James observed, studying them through a small telescope. All armed, but they're not keeping any guards posted. Either they're very confident or very stupid. "Probably both," Ayanna replied. "Stupid men often believe they are clever." James smiled at her observation, then raised his voice to address the rustlers. "You men in the canyon. You're surrounded by armed riders. Release those cattle and ride out peacefully, and nobody gets hurt." The response was immediate, shouts of alarm and the sound of rifles being cocked. The rustlers scrambled for cover behind rocks and fallen trees, abandoning any pretense that they were legitimate cowboys with rights to the cattle. "That's your answer," one of the thieves yelled back. "Come and take these cows if you think you can." "Well," James said calmly, checking his rifle, "I guess we do this the hard way." The battle that followed was brief but intense. The rustlers were experienced fighters, but their position in the canyon bottom left them vulnerable to fire from above. James's men had clear shots and used them effectively, while the thieves could only fire blindly upward at muzzle flashes among the rocks. Ayanna watched the engagement with professional interest, noting the cowboys' discipline and marksmanship. These were definitely former soldiers, their movements and tactics showed military training adapted to civilian circumstances. They coordinated their fire, conserved ammunition, and maintained steady pressure without taking unnecessary risks. Within 15 minutes, 3 rustlers were wounded and the rest were calling for surrender. James accepted immediately, ordering his men to hold their fire while the thieves threw down their weapons and emerged from cover with raised hands. "Danny, take 4 men down there and secure those prisoners," James commanded. "Check on the wounded, we'll get them to a doctor if they need one. Pete, you and the others gather up our cattle and get them ready to move." As his orders were carried out, James turned to Ayanna with an expression that mixed gratitude, respect, and something else she could not quite identify. "Miss Ayanna," he said formally, "I owe you a debt I can never fully repay. Without your help, we'd have lost good men trying to dig those rustlers out of that canyon." "You owe me nothing," she replied. "Cattle thieves are enemies to all honest people." "Maybe so, but you didn't have to help us. You could have watched us ride into an ambush and counted it justice for old grievances." Ayanna considered this as they watched the cowboys efficiently round up the recovered cattle. "Perhaps I helped because I wanted to understand what kind of man you really are." "And what did you learn?" She studied his face, weathered by sun and wind, marked by experiences both good and difficult, but honest in a way that was becoming impossible to deny. "I learned that some white men keep their word even when it costs them," she said finally. "I learned that former soldiers can choose honor over hatred. And I learned that enemies can become allies when they face greater threats together." James was quiet for a long moment, and, when he spoke, his voice carried an emotion that made Ayanna's heart beat faster despite her best efforts to remain unaffected. "Miss Ayanna, I'd like to think we could be more than just allies." The simple statement hung in the desert air between them, charged with possibilities that neither had fully acknowledged until this moment. Ayanna felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, not literally, but in ways that were far more profound. Everything she had believed about white men, about enemies and friends, about the clear lines between Apache and non-Apache worlds, was becoming complicated in ways she had never imagined. "I do not know what that means," she said honestly. "Neither do I," James admitted. "But I'd like to find out, if you're willing." As they rode back toward the cowboy camp with the recovered cattle, Ayanna found herself thinking about choices and consequences, about the difference between what she had always been taught and what she was beginning to discover for herself. The Apache woman who feared no man was beginning to fear something else entirely, the possibility that everything she thought she knew about her heart was about to change forever. 2 weeks had passed since the Rustler incident, and Ayanna found herself in an impossible situation. James Thornton's cattle drive had moved on toward California as originally planned, but not before something fundamental had changed between them. What had begun as mutual respect between former enemies had grown into something neither had expected and both were struggling to understand. The Apache Tribal Council had praised Ayanna's handling of the cowboy situation. Her successful negotiation and the assistance in recovering stolen cattle had demonstrated both diplomatic skill and tactical wisdom. Chief Nailnish had publicly commended his daughter's leadership, and the elders agreed that her approach had protected Apache interests without unnecessary bloodshed. But, privately, Ayanna faced growing turmoil that threatened everything she had always believed about herself and her place in the world. James Thornton occupied her thoughts far more than any man ever had, white or Apache. When she closed her eyes, she saw his gray eyes and remembered the respectful way he spoke to her. When she practiced with weapons, she found herself wondering what he would think of her skills. When tribal discussions turned to relations with white settlers, she caught herself defending viewpoints she would never have considered before meeting him. Most troubling of all, she had begun to question whether the clear lines she had always drawn between friend and enemy were as simple as she had believed. "Sister, you seem distracted lately," observed her brother Keem as they rode together on a hunting expedition. "The other warriors have noticed. Some wonder if the white cowboys cast some kind of spell on you." "That is foolish talk," Ayanna replied sharply. "No one casts spells on me." "Then, why do you stare toward the west so often? And why do you ask so many questions about cattle drives and California?" Ayanna had no good answer for her brother's observations because they were entirely accurate. She did find herself looking westward, imagining James and his men moving across unfamiliar territory with their herd. She had asked Cookie several questions about their route and timing before they departed, telling herself she was simply gathering intelligence about white activities in the region. "I think about many things," she said finally. "A war leader must understand all potential threats and opportunities." Keem was quiet for several minutes as they tracked deer signs through a dry creek bed. Finally, he spoke again, his voice careful and concerned. "Ayanna, I have known you all my life. You are the strongest, most dedicated defender of our people I have ever seen. But something has changed in you since meeting that cowboy leader. Father sees it too, though he does not speak of it directly." "Nothing has changed," she insisted. "I remain loyal to our people and our ways." "Your loyalty is not in question. Your happiness is." This observation struck closer to the truth than Ayanna wanted to acknowledge. She was not happy, had not been truly happy since watching James ride away with his cattle and men. She felt as though part of herself had departed with them, leaving behind an emptiness she could not fill with traditional activities and responsibilities. "Happiness is not the most important thing," she said. "Duty comes first." "Does it?" Keem asked gently. "Our grandmother used to say that a heart at war with itself cannot serve anyone well. Perhaps you need to understand your own feelings before you can lead others effectively." That evening, Ayanna sat alone on her favorite cliff overlooking the tribal lands, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. Keem's words echoed in her mind, forcing her to confront truths she had been avoiding. She was indeed at war with herself, torn between a lifetime of conditioning and new experiences that challenged everything she thought she knew. James Thornton represented everything she had been taught to resist: a white man, a former soldier, someone whose people had taken Apache lands and forced her tribe toward an uncertain future. by all logic and tradition, she should consider him an enemy regardless of his personal character. But logic and tradition had not prepared her for someone who treated her as an equal, who respected her intelligence and skills, who kept his word even when it cost him. James had shown her that white men could be honorable, that former enemies could become allies, and that perhaps the world was more complicated than the simple categories of friend and foe she had always used. "You look troubled, daughter," said Chief Nailnish, approaching quietly in the way of experienced warriors. Ayanna had been so lost in thought that she had not heard him coming, something that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. "Father, I was watching the stars and thinking about our people's future." The chief settled beside her on the rocky ledge, his weathered face thoughtful. "Our future is indeed uncertain. The white government grows stronger each year, and more tribes are forced onto reservations. Soon we may face choices we do not want to make." "What kind of choices?" "Whether to fight hopelessly against overwhelming force, or find ways to preserve what we can of our culture and people under new circumstances." Chief Nailnish studied his daughter's profile. "Such choices require wisdom rather than just courage. Sometimes the strongest warriors are those who know when not to fight." Ayanna sensed deeper meaning in her father's words but was not certain how to interpret them. "Are you saying we should surrender to the white government?" "I am saying that survival sometimes requires adaptation. The buffalo herds grow smaller each year. The old ways become harder to maintain. Perhaps our people need leaders who can understand both Apache traditions and the changing world around us." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, listening to night sounds from the desert below. Finally, Chief Nailnish spoke again, his voice carefully neutral. "I have heard interesting reports about your interactions with the cattle drive leader. The warriors who accompanied you speak of unusual respect between former enemies." Ayanna felt heat rise in her cheeks, grateful for the darkness that concealed her reaction. "James Thornton proved to be an honorable man. That does not make him a friend." "Honorable enemies are rarer than precious gems," her father observed. "They should be valued accordingly." "What are you suggesting?" Chief Nailnish was quiet for a long moment, and, when he spoke, his words carried the weight of careful consideration. "I am suggesting that leaders must sometimes build bridges across divides that seem impossible to cross. Your grandmother was famous for her wisdom in finding peaceful solutions to conflicts that others thought could only be settled by warfare. Grandmother dealt with other Apache tribes, not white invaders. The principles remain the same. Understanding one's apparent enemies often reveals they are not enemies at all, merely people with different needs and circumstances." As Ayanna pondered her father's words, a commotion arose from the village below. Horses galloping fast, voices calling out an alarm, sounds that typically meant danger approaching. Both father and daughter immediately rose and started down the cliff path toward their people. "What is the trouble?" Chief Nailnish called to the first warrior they encountered. "Riders approaching from the east," the man replied breathlessly. "Perhaps 20 men, moving fast. They will reach our village within the hour." "Apache or white men?" Ayanna asked. "White men, but not soldiers. They look like cowboys or settlers, heavily armed." Ayanna felt cold dread settle in her stomach. 20 armed white men approaching at night could only mean trouble. Cattle rustlers seeking revenge for their captured companions? Settlers planning to drive the Apache from valuable land? Or worse, vigilantes seeking to eliminate what they saw as an Indian threat? "Gather the warriors," Chief Nailnish commanded. "Prepare defensive positions but do not attack unless they show hostile intent. We will meet them at the village edge and learn their purpose." As the tribe mobilized for potential conflict, Ayanna found herself thinking about James Thornton and his men. They had departed 2 weeks ago, supposedly heading for California. But what if some crisis had brought them back? What if these approaching riders were connected to the cattle drive somehow? The possibility seemed unlikely, but Ayanna could not shake the feeling that tonight's events might somehow involve the cowboy who had affected her so deeply. Within 30 minutes, Apache warriors had taken positions around their village while women, children, and elders moved to protected areas. Chief Nailnish and Ayana, flanked by their best fighters, rode out to meet the approaching strangers at a safe distance from their homes. The riders they encountered in the moonlight were indeed cowboys, but not the organized, disciplined group Ayana remembered from James's cattle drive. These men looked rough and desperate, their horses lathered from hard riding. Most troubling, several appeared to be wounded, with crude bandages visible in the pale light. "Hold there!" Chief Nailnish called out in English when the two groups were 50 yards apart. "State your business on Apache land." The lead rider, a bearded man with a bloody cloth tied around his arm, urged his horse forward a few steps. "We're looking for some of our boys who went missing a couple weeks back. Heard tell there was some kind of fight with Apache warriors around here." Ayana felt understanding dawn like a cold sunrise. These were associates of the rustlers James's group had captured. They had come seeking their missing companions, and their condition suggested they had recently been in a fight themselves. "We know nothing of missing men," Chief Nailnish replied carefully. "But we have no quarrel with peaceful travelers." "Peaceful, hell," snarled another rider. "Our boys disappeared right around here, and we know damn well what happened to them. You Apache killed them, and we come to settle the score." "Your friends were cattle thieves," Ayana said coldly, recognizing that denial would be both useless and dangerous. "They stole livestock and were captured by the men they robbed. What happened to them afterward is not our affair." The bearded leader's expression turned ugly. "So you admit you were involved?" "We figured as much." "Well, here's how it's going to be. You're going to tell us exactly what happened to our partners, and you're going to pay for any harm that came to them." "And if we refuse?" Chief Nailnish asked calmly. "Then, we'll burn your village and take payment in Apache blood," the man replied viciously. Ayana counted the enemy riders carefully. 20 men as reported, all armed, several wounded but still capable of fighting. Her own force consisted of 15 warriors plus herself and her father. The numbers were close enough that the outcome of any battle would depend on tactics and terrain rather than sheer force. More importantly, she realized that these men were clearly desperate. Their wounded condition and willingness to threaten an entire Apache village suggested they had recently suffered some major defeat and were looking for someone to blame for their troubles. "You mentioned cattle thieves being captured," said a younger cowboy who looked less hostile than his companions. "What happened to the men who caught them?" "They continued on their way," Ayana replied truthfully. "They had no interest in your friends beyond recovering stolen property." "Which way did they go?" the bearded leader demanded. Ayana hesitated. James and his men had at least a 2-week head start, but these riders looked capable of covering ground quickly. If she told them the truth, she might be sending them after people who had treated her with respect and honor. If she lied or refused to answer, the immediate threat to her village would likely escalate into violence. "Why do you ask?" she said finally. "Because those bastards killed 3 of our men and wounded 4 others," the leader snarled. "We tracked them this far before losing their trail, but we know they came through Apache territory. You're going to tell us which way they went, or we'll assume you're protecting them." The implied threat was clear, but Ayana found herself facing a moral dilemma that went far beyond immediate tactical considerations. These men wanted to pursue James and his cowboys for revenge, but James had only defended stolen property and captured thieves. To give his enemies information about his route would be betraying someone who had shown her trust and respect. On the other hand, refusing to cooperate would almost certainly result in an attack on her village, putting her people at risk to protect white men they had known for only a few days. "Father," she said quietly in Apache, "I need to speak with you privately for a moment." Chief Nailnish nodded and they rode a short distance away from both groups, far enough to talk without being overheard but close enough to respond quickly if violence erupted. "These men will attack our village if we do not give them what they want," Ayana said urgently. "But the cowboys they seek treated us with honor." "What do we owe to whom?" "That is a question each leader must answer for themselves," her father replied. "But I will say this: enemies who threaten our people deserve no consideration. Friends who have kept their word deserve whatever help we can provide without destroying ourselves." "Then, you think I should refuse to tell them about James's route?"
Chief Nailnish studied the hostile riders, then looked back at his daughter.
I think you should follow your heart and accept the consequences. A leader who cannot trust her own judgment about right and wrong cannot lead others effectively. As they rejoined the tense confrontation, Ayanna realized that this moment would define not just her immediate future but her understanding of herself as a person and a leader. Everything she had believed about loyalty, duty, and the clear divisions between friend and enemy was being tested by circumstances that forced her to choose between competing obligations. The bearded rider was growing impatient.
Well, you going to tell us which way those cattle thieves went, or do we have to persuade you?
Ayanna looked at the hostile faces surrounding her, then at her father and warriors, and finally up at the star-filled sky where her grandmother's spirit might be watching. When she spoke, her voice carried absolute conviction. The men you seek headed west toward California 2 weeks ago. But I will tell you this, if you pursue them seeking revenge for crimes your own friends committed, you will find more trouble than you bargained for. They are honorable men who defended their property. You are thieves and murderers who threaten innocent people. Choose your path carefully. The bearded leader's face contorted with rage. You Apache bitch. You think you can threaten us? Boys, looks like we need to teach these savages some respect. As hands moved toward weapons and horses shifted nervously in the moonlight, Ayanna felt time slow to crystalline clarity. She had made her choice, to protect James even at great cost to herself and her people. Now she would discover whether her heart had led her toward wisdom or disaster. The battle that was about to begin would test everything she had learned about courage, leadership, and the complicated nature of loyalty in a world where the lines between friend and enemy were no longer as clear as she had once believed. The gunfight that erupted in the moonlit desert was brief but devastating. The vengeful riders, already wounded and desperate, fought with vicious determination but lacked the tactical discipline of Ayanna's Apache warriors. When the shooting stopped 15 minutes later, 8 of the attackers lay dead and 6 others were too badly wounded to continue fighting. The remaining 6 had fled into the night, abandoning their wounded companions. The Apache had paid a price for their victory. 3 warriors were wounded, 1 seriously, and Chief Nailnish had taken a bullet through his shoulder. But they had successfully defended their village, and, more importantly for Ayanna, they had prevented the pursuit of James Thornton and his men. As dawn broke over the battlefield, Ayanna found herself tending to her father's wound while grappling with the consequences of her decision. She had chosen to protect a white cowboy over the immediate safety of her own people, and, while the outcome had been favorable, the choice itself marked a fundamental change in her understanding of loyalty and obligation. You fought well, daughter, Chief Nailnish said as she cleaned and bandaged his wound. But I suspect you fought for more than just Apache honor. I fought for what I believed was right, Ayanna replied carefully. Yes. And that is exactly what a true leader must do, even when the cost is high. Her father studied her face with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. The question now is what you will do about the feelings that drove such a dangerous choice. Before Ayanna could respond, a commotion arose from the village. Riders approaching again, but, this time, the sentries called out that the newcomers appeared to be friendly. Ayanna felt her heart leap as she recognized the possibility that somehow, impossibly, James might be returning. Racing to the edge of the village, she saw a sight that made her question her own eyes. James Thornton was indeed riding toward them, but not alone. Behind him came 12 of his cowboys, driving a small herd of horses, and, beside him rode a woman Ayanna had never seen before. The woman was clearly white, perhaps 30 years old, with golden hair and an elegant bearing that spoke of education and refinement. She wore a traveling dress of fine fabric and sat her horse with obvious skill, but everything about her suggested civilization and comfort rather than frontier hardship. As James drew closer, Ayanna could see concern and urgency in his expression. He had obviously ridden hard to return, and the presence of the unknown woman added a mystery that made Ayanna's stomach clench with unexpected emotion. "Miss Ayanna," James called out as he approached. "We heard gunshots in the distance and saw smoke. Are you and your people safe?" "We are safe," she replied, struggling to keep her voice level. "But why have you returned? And who is this woman?" James dismounted quickly, his eyes scanning the evidence of recent battle with professional assessment. We encountered some men on the trail who said they were heading this way looking for trouble. When we realized they might be connected to those rustlers we captured, I decided we needed to come back and warn you.
You returned to warn us of danger?
Ayana felt something warm and complicated unfurl in her chest.
Of course I did, James said simply. You helped us when you didn't have to.
The least we could do was make sure our problems didn't spill over onto your people.
The golden-haired woman chose that moment to dismount gracefully from her horse. James, perhaps you should introduce me to your Apache friend?
Her voice carried the cultured accent of education and social position, and, when she smiled at Ayana, it was with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to making good impressions on strangers.
Miss Ayana, James said with obvious reluctance, this is Miss Catherine Whitmore from San Francisco.
Catherine, this is Ayana, the Apache war leader I told you about. Catherine extended her hand in a gesture that was clearly meant to be friendly, though her eyes assessed Ayana with sharp intelligence.
I'm delighted to meet you, Miss Ayana.
James has told me so much about your remarkable abilities. Ayana accepted the handshake but felt immediate tension. Everything about Catherine Whitmore, her clothes, her manner, her obvious familiarity with James, suggested a relationship that went far beyond casual acquaintance.
Miss Whitmore was traveling to California on the same route, James explained, his discomfort obvious.
When we learned about potential trouble here, she insisted on coming along to help tend any wounded. How thoughtful, Ayana managed, though her voice carried an edge that made James wince.
I'm actually a trained nurse, Catherine said brightly. I've been working in field hospitals for several years.
When James told me about your people possibly facing danger, I felt it was my duty to offer assistance. The woman's obvious competence and genuine desire to help made it impossible for Ayana to dislike her on any reasonable grounds. But reason had little to do with the sharp jealousy that cut through her chest as she watched Catherine place a familiar hand on James's arm. Your concern is appreciated, Ayana said formally, but our wounded are already being cared for by our own medicine people.
Of course, Catherine replied smoothly.
I'm sure they're very skilled.
But perhaps I could offer some additional supplies? I have modern medical equipment that might be useful.
Chief Nailnish chose that moment to approach, his wounded arm supported by a sling improvised from leather straps.
James immediately stepped forward with obvious concern. Chief, it's good to see you again. I'm sorry to see you've been hurt.
The wounds are not serious, Chief Nailnish replied in careful English. We are grateful you returned to warn us of danger, though the danger has already passed.
What happened? James asked, studying the battlefield debris.
Ayana briefly explained the encounter with the vengeful riders, leaving out her internal conflict about revealing his route. As she spoke, she noticed Catherine watching her with growing interest and, what might have been respect.
You fought 20 armed men with 15 warriors? Catherine asked. That's quite remarkable.
Apache warriors are taught to use terrain and tactics rather than relying on numbers alone, Ayana replied stiffly. Still, it must have required considerable courage and leadership ability.
Catherine's tone carried genuine admiration.
James told me you were exceptional, but I didn't realize quite how exceptional. The compliment should have pleased Ayana, but coming from this elegant woman who clearly held James's attention made it feel more like condescension. Everything about Catherine Whitmore reminded Ayana of the vast differences between her own world and the civilization that James came from. We should examine your wounded and make sure they have everything they need, James said, clearly trying to move the conversation away from uncomfortable territory. As the group moved toward the village, Ayana found herself walking beside Catherine while James spoke with Chief Nailnish about the recent battle. Despite her jealousy, she could not help noticing that Catherine seemed genuinely interested in Apache culture and asked respectful questions about their customs and way of life. I hope you don't mind my saying so, Catherine said quietly, but James speaks of you with extraordinary respect. He says you're one of the finest leaders he's ever encountered, regardless of race or gender. He has been fair in his dealings with my people, Ayana replied carefully. More than fair, from what I understand. He told me how you helped recover his cattle and probably saved several lives in the process.
That kind of cooperation between former enemies is quite remarkable. Ayana glanced at the other woman, trying to understand her purpose in this conversation.
You speak as if you know much about such matters.
I've spent several years working in areas of conflict, Catherine explained.
I've seen what hatred and distrust can accomplish, and I've also seen what can happen when people choose cooperation over revenge.
What you and James achieved is genuinely extraordinary.
They had reached the village now, and Ayana watched as Catherine efficiently examined the wounded Apache warriors with gentle competence. Her medical supplies were indeed superior to what the tribe possessed, and she shared them generously while showing respectful deference to the Apache medicine man's traditional treatments. She combines the two approaches very skillfully, Chief Nailnish observed quietly to his daughter.
Modern medicine and traditional healing often work well together when practitioners respect each other.
Ayana nodded absently, but her attention was focused on James as he moved through the village. The warriors who had fought beside him against the rustlers treated him with obvious respect, and he returned their greetings with the easy camaraderie of shared danger. Watching him interact with her people, Ayana realized how naturally he fit into their community despite the vast cultural differences.
He cares about you, you know, Catherine said suddenly, appearing at Ayana's side with the quiet efficiency she seemed to bring to everything.
I do not know what you mean, Ayana replied, though her heart rate increased significantly. James Thornton is not a man who makes decisions lightly, especially when those decisions involve risk to his men and responsibilities.
Yet he turned an entire cattle drive around and rode back into potential danger because he was worried about your safety.
That tells me everything I need to know about his feelings.
Ayana studied Catherine's face, searching for signs of jealousy or territorial challenge. Instead, she found something that looked almost like encouragement.
You speak strangely for someone who travels with him.
Catherine smiled, and, for the first time, it seemed completely genuine rather than socially polite. James and I are old friends, Miss Ayana.
We grew up in the same town, and our families have known each other for years. When I decided to travel to California, it seemed natural to join his cattle drive for safety and companionship.
That is all? Just friendship?
That is all it has ever been, despite what some people might assume.
Catherine's expression grew more serious.
James is a good man who deserves to find happiness with someone who truly understands him. I've watched him with other women over the years, women from our social circle who could offer him position and comfort.
He's never shown real interest in any of them. Why are you telling me this?
Because I've also watched him these past weeks talking about an Apache woman who impressed him more than anyone he's ever met. He speaks of your courage, your intelligence, your integrity, but mostly he speaks of how you made him see the world differently. Catherine paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. James needs someone who challenges him and matches his strength. He needs someone who can stand beside him as an equal rather than behind him as decoration. Before Ayana could respond to this unexpected revelation, James himself approached them.
Catherine, thank you for looking after the wounded.
Your supplies have made a real difference.
It was my pleasure, Catherine replied. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I should help pack up my equipment. We've imposed on these good people's hospitality long enough.
As Catherine moved away with obvious tact, James turned to face Ayana directly. For a moment, neither spoke, but the air between them seemed charged with unspoken questions and unacknowledged emotions.
Thank you for coming back, Ayana said finally. It was unexpected.
I couldn't stay away knowing you might be in danger, James replied simply.
Even if it meant risking my men and my responsibilities. Why? The question hung between them like a bridge that could either connect their worlds or collapse under the weight of impossible circumstances.
James looked around at the Apache village, at the evidence of recent battle, at the life Ayana had built among her own people. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of emotions he could no longer hide. Because somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of you as an Apache warrior who happened to be a woman, and started thinking of you as the woman I.
He stopped, shaking his head. This is impossible, isn't it? What is impossible? Everything I'm feeling. Everything I want to say to you.
The fact that I'm standing in an Apache village talking to a woman who could outfight most men I know, and all I can think about is how beautiful you look in the morning light." Ayana felt her heart stop, then restart with a rhythm that seemed to shake her entire body.
"James. I know," he said quickly. "I know it's crazy. I know we come from different worlds that have been at war with each other. I know that even if you felt something for me too, there's no way we could make it work. But I had to tell you anyway."
For several long moments, Ayana struggled with emotions and possibilities that threatened to overwhelm her carefully constructed understanding of herself and her place in the world. Everything she had been taught about loyalty, duty, and the proper order of things warred with feelings that grew stronger every time she looked into James's gray eyes. "There might be a way," she heard herself saying. James looked at her with such hope and wonder that she felt her heart break a little.
"What do you mean?" "My father has spoken of changes coming to our people.
The old ways of life are becoming impossible to maintain. Perhaps some Apache people will need to find new ways to survive while keeping what matters most about who we are."
"Are you saying what I think you're saying?"
Ayana took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything forever. "I am saying that an Apache woman who has learned to respect and care for a white cowboy might find ways to bridge two worlds, if that cowboy felt the same about her." James stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her face.
"That cowboy does feel the same. More than he's ever felt about anything or anyone."
"Then, perhaps we should explore these feelings and see where they lead us."
"Even if it means leaving your people? Or bringing someone new into them," Ayana replied.
"My father has said that survival sometimes requires adaptation.
Perhaps loving someone from another world is one kind of adaptation."
James reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose. When she didn't, he gently took her hands in his.
"Miss Ayana, would you do me the honor of allowing me to court you properly?
I do not know what courting means in your world. In my world, it means spending time together, learning about each other, and discovering whether two people who care about each other can build a life together."
Ayana smiled, feeling something bright and wonderful unfurl in her chest. "In my world, it means much the same thing. Yes, James Thornton. I would like to learn about courting."
As they stood together in the morning sunlight, surrounded by the evidence of battles fought and won, Ayana realized that the greatest challenge of her life was just beginning. She had feared no man in combat, but loving someone across the vast divide of different worlds would require courage she had never needed before. But, looking into James's eyes, seeing the respect and wonder and genuine affection reflected there, she felt ready to meet that challenge. The Apache woman who had always been a warrior was about to discover what it meant to be a woman in love. 6 months later, as autumn painted the desert mountains in brilliant colors, Ayana stood on the same cliff where she had first spoken the words "I fear no man." But, now those words carried different meaning. She no longer feared men as enemies to be conquered in battle. Instead, she had learned to trust one man completely, to build a partnership that honored both their traditions while creating something entirely new. James had indeed courted her properly, spending months learning Apache customs while teaching her about his own world. Chief Nailnish had eventually given his blessing to their union, recognizing that his daughter's happiness and the tribe's survival might both depend on building bridges across cultural divides. Their wedding had been a celebration that combined Apache and white traditions, witnessed by tribal members and cowboys alike. Catherine Whitmore had served as matron of honor, having become a genuine friend to Ayana and a valuable liaison between their two communities. Now, as Ayana watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, she felt James's arms circle her waist from behind. His chin rested on her shoulder as they looked out over the land that had become their shared home. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. Ayana leaned back against his strength, thinking about all the battles she had won and lost, all the choices that had led to this moment.
"Only one," she said.
"What's that?" She turned in his arms to face him, seeing love and contentment in those remarkable gray eyes. "I regret that it took me so long to understand that the greatest courage is not in conquering enemies, but in opening your heart to love." James smiled and bent to kiss her, a gesture that still sent warmth through her entire being.
"Well, Mrs. Thornton, I'd say you figured it out just in time."
As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ayana reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this place. She had begun as an Apache warrior who feared no man and trusted no white person. She had become a woman who had learned that love could indeed bridge any divide, if two people were willing to build that bridge together with patience, respect, and unwavering commitment to each other. The desert winds stirred around them, carrying the scents of sage and distant rain. Somewhere in that vast landscape, Apache bands and white settlers were still learning to coexist, still struggling with questions of territory and survival and cultural identity. But, here on this cliff, in the arms of the man who had taught her that enemies could become lovers, Ayanna had found her own answer to those struggles. Love was not weakness, as she had once believed. Love was the strongest force in the universe, strong enough to transform enemies into allies, strong enough to build bridges across impossible divides, strong enough to create new worlds where two people could stand together against any challenge. Ayanna, who had once feared no man, had discovered something far more powerful than fearlessness. She had discovered what it meant to love and be loved without reservation, and that knowledge would sustain her through all the adventures yet to come.